Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Do weapons sold to Saudi Arabia by Britain break international humanitarian law with their use in Yemen? And if so, what should be our response? Newsnight's learned of extraordinary divisions between the legislators trying to answer that exact question. Last night, you'll remember this programme saw evidence that the Committees on Arms Export Controls was recommending Britain stop selling weapons to Saudi for use in Yemen in a war where many civilians have been bombed. But tonight, further leaks show certain MPs trying to water down that draft report, with some rowing back altogether. The committee met again earlier this evening to try to hammer out a uniform response. Gabriel Gatehouse has been following the story. He joins me now. How did that meeting end, Gabriel?
Late is how it ended, Emily, and we don't know whether it ended in agreement because the members are sworn to secrecy and they won't tell us. But given the divisions, I very much doubt it at the moment. I mean, the draft report that we saw yesterday basically said it was inevitable that weapons supplied by Britain were being used by the Saudis in that Saudi-led coalition in Yemen in contravention of international humanitarian law. That's basically war crimes. But it is a draft, and tonight we've seen the proposed amendments. We've got 11 pages here in total. This is the kind of thing that happens with these reports. People write it up and then their amendments come in. But what's unusual here is to get an insight into the process, especially on this most controversial of issues. Now, most of the amendments here come from two MPs, the Conservative Crispin Blunt and the Labour MP John Speller. And what we see, really, is a concerted effort to water down, or in some cases completely eliminate, criticism or questions about the legality of Britain's continued arms sales. Let's just take the summary. Here's what the original draft says. There's been very serious evidence of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, including the targeting of civilian areas and medical facilities and the use of cluster munitions. Now, both John Speller and Crispin Blunt want the phrase very serious evidence removed and replaced with just allegations. Crispin Blunt wants references to the targeting of civilian areas and medical facilities and cluster munitions removed altogether. Then the draft goes on. We believe there must be an independent United Nations-led investigation of these alleged violations, and we call upon the UK government to support and press for such an investigation. Crispin Blunt slightly softens the language on this to refer to alleged violations by all parties to the conflict. John Speller wants the reference to an independent investigation removed altogether. Both Speller and Blunt take exception to the next sentence. Given that the UK has a long history of defence exports to Saudi Arabia, and considering the evidence we've heard, it seems inevitable that any violations of international humanitarian and human rights law by the coalition have involved arms supplied from the UK. They both want that changed to a simple allegation. And then comes the recommendations. We therefore recommend, the draft says, that Her Majesty's government suspend sales of arms which could be used in Yemen to Saudi Arabia until the independent UN-led investigation has come to its conclusions. Crispin Blunt replaces that recommendation with a reference to a legal case that'll come before the High Court next year. John Speller removes it altogether.
So, Gabriel, you mentioned Crispin Blunt and John Speller. Just talk us through who they are and their positions.
Yeah. OK, well, Crispin Blunt is Conservative MP for Reigate in Surrey, chair of the influential Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He's there on the right. John Speller, Labour MP for Whalley in the West Midlands, is a former Armed Forces Minister, and he also sits on the Defence Select Committee. So both fairly senior MPs in their respective parties. Interestingly, both have in the past been members of the pro-Saudi all-party parliamentary group for Saudi Arabia. Now, if you look through Crispin Blunt's declarations of his members' interests, you see that he did declare some paid work in 2005 for a defence company that was part of BAE Systems. This was more than 10 years ago, we should emphasise. He told me it wasn't a lot of money. He told me the work was unrelated to Saudi Arabia. John Speller, interestingly, has a record of defending arms sales to Saudi Arabia on the grounds that it creates British jobs. None of this is necessarily unusual. It's certainly not improper, but it gives you a sense of where people stand. We did ask both of them to talk to us tonight. They didn't want to.
And you have got a sense of the extent now of the British arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which has become clearer.
So we know that we sell a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia. About a third of our arms exports go to Saudi. But what's startling is the extent to which it's increased since Saudi Arabia began its end campaign over Yemen. So according to the draft report, the UK sold more than £3.3 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia in the first 12 months of the war, which started in March last year. Now, just to put that in context, that figure represents a 30-fold increase on the same period the previous year.
Any response tonight from the government?
Yes, the Foreign Office, who also didn't want to come on the programme, but did send us a statement. They say what they usually say. They operate one of the most robust arms export control regimes in the world, and that they're satisfied that their arms sales are in line with their international legal obligations. The trouble is that this report, in its current form, suggests that simply isn't credible.
Gabriel, thanks very much. Well, last night the Saudi foreign minister entered the debate saying it was in Britain's interest to supply Saudi with arms for Yemen to help them fight Iran-backed rebel groups, which would increase the risk of terrorism in Britain and beyond. Certainly, British-Saudi relations are complicated. We know that. Their tentacles go beyond economics to security, diplomacy and strategic Middle Eastern alliances. So can we afford to upset Saudi Arabia on this question of arms sales, or does the question betray cowardice? Joining us now to discuss, Simon Mail, the former Lieutenant General and former Senior British Military Advisor on the Middle East, and Hilary Benn, former Shadow Foreign Secretary. Very nice to have you both here, gentlemen. Hilary Benn, you wanted the government to be investigated over this. From what is coming out tonight, what do you make of it? Where are we?
Well, it remains to be seen what report the CAKE Committee, the Committee on Arms Exports Controls, finally decides. But I've been calling for some months now for arms sales to be suspended because there have been numerous reports of breaches of international humanitarian law by the UN panel, by Human Rights Watch and other organisations, by both sides. I think it's really important to emphasise that point, the Houthi rebels as well as the Saudi-led coalition. We have legislation, and criterion 2 of what are called the consolidated criteria says that we should not be exporting if there is a clear risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law. So for me, the issue is, are we upholding the law that Parliament has passed? And
it seems extraordinary, General Mail, to ignore that if all the signs coming out of it is that we're breaking humanitarian law.
Well, I don't think that's been proven yet, certainly not conclusively. And I think what Gabriel was indicating was the usual, dare I say, conflicting interests within these committees. There are people, including those who give evidence. I gave evidence to, as Hilary said, the CAKE Committee, who are viscerally anti the whole of defence industry and defence sales. There are people on it who are viscerally against the Saudi government for a number of reasons. There are people who are deeply, I have to say, misinformed about the realities of the situation in Yemen. And there are those who really are not being really sensible
Is Hilary Benn one of those?
About the threats.
When you talk about this visceral dislike?
I think Hilary Benn may well have perfectly respectable concerns about issues to do with Saudi Arabia, issues to do with the Gulf, issues to do with defence sales.
It's interesting, though, isn't it?
There is a big regional issue here about who is really responsible when 50,000 Houthis are able to, frankly, hold in hock 27 million people in Yemen. And we know where the finger points, I'm afraid, and it is to Iran, who are interfering all across the region.
Would you accept that Saudi often becomes a lightning rod for this kind of criticism? There is perhaps a distaste amongst much of the British public for our relations with Saudi for a number of reasons.
Well, it's a very complex relationship. It's a very important one because the security cooperation we have with Saudi Arabia, because we face a common threat, is very, very important. But I think with people you have a long-standing relationship with, you need to be honest. Now, Simon is absolutely right that the Houthi rebellion, there's a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, and the Saudi-led coalition is supported by a UN resolution. It's important to recognise that. But this is about how that campaign is conducted. And given that we have received repeated reports of civilians being hit and affected, and that's why international humanitarian law is so important. The way to resolve the argument, Emily, that has been going on, people saying, no, it isn't, yes, it is to have an independent international investigation.
Which we know is not going on because Saudi wants to conduct it itself. And when you're hearing there are 119...
And Saudi is conducting its own as well.
But you're happy with that? You're happy for Saudi to be conducting its own...
14 nations are in the joint intelligence assessment team.
What do you make, though, of the UN report calling the Saudi operation against civilians widespread and systematic, or the 119 sorties rated to human violations? And what would it take to make you uncomfortable with this situation?
Well, I have to say, the nature of the operation there is extremely complex.
But you didn't even want this investigated, right? You didn't even think this should be investigated.
I certainly don't think that we have enough weight of evidence, I'm afraid, that tells us that we should be suspending frankly, that one of the most important aspects of our relationship with a key ally in the Gulf who is involved in a major aspect of countering Daesh, countering AP.
So it's about pragmatism, really, and it's about security. And whatever they do in Yemen, maybe we should, start looking further afield and thinking of the risks to Britain.
No, I don't think we should be doing that. Look, the government of the United Kingdom has showed itself, I think, incapable of doing its job, because the first part of this year...
It's not just the government. I mean, it's colleagues like John Speller on your own side, right?
But the government ultimately has the responsibility, the UK government, to apply its own legislation. And for a long time it said, we've made an assessment, we don't think they're breaches of international humanitarian law. They said that in answers to me, as Gabriel Gatehouse was reporting on this programme. Then suddenly, at the last day of the parliamentary session, they said, sorry, that wasn't quite right. We've been unable to make an assessment. And then on Monday, the Foreign Secretary said, when it comes to this question, is there a clear risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law? He said, based on the information we've got, Emily, he said, we don't think that test has been met. Now, we don't know what assessment has been done. In all fairness to the Saudis, I don't think it's right to expect them to do it in a way that's going to command confidence. That is why we need an international,
Do you think
independent
we can
investigation.
pause our selling of arms to Saudi and still expect them to help out on all the things that Simon Mail was talking about, whether it's anti-terror, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's strategic alliances in the Middle East? Would they still do that?
In the context of our failure to tackle Assad, in the context of our failure to reassure our Sunni Muslim allies in the Gulf when we did the nuclear deal with Iran, in our context of not supporting the Bahrainis, or at least understanding the context, this would just be yet another blow to any sense of the Americans as well and ourselves being reliable allies.
So we shut our eyes, essentially?
We do not shut our eyes because we engage. And if you don't wish to be engaged and they feel really deeply insecure at the moment, they will go to people who really could not care less about international humanitarian law, and that is the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians.
Moral relativism is a really dodgy place to be. What if we don't sell them arms, then the Russians will, and that'll be worse? That's a weird place to come from.
The debate in this report shows that there is not a clear-cut evidence that there have been breaches of international
humanitarian law. So is it pragmatism or cowardice?
That's precisely the argument for having an independent international investigation. And the sooner that can be done, the sooner we can all know the answer to the question, have there been these breaches of international humanitarian law on both sides, and then take the appropriate action. It's our legislation that actually the last Labour government put it on the statute book. It's really important we uphold it, including in honest conversation with our friends and partners, because that relationship with Saudi Arabia is important, even though we have other criticisms in relation to their policy on human rights and their use of the death penalty, which I'm very strongly opposed to.
We've run out, I'm afraid, but thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. So, grammar schools back in the headlines again this evening after yesterday's accidental suspicions they would have to come again. The Prime Minister was quizzed on the topic. It was earlier today by backbenchers. Many who were happy to see their return. Nick Watts here and has the latest. Take us through the committee meeting tonight then, Nick.
Well, we're learning that our new Prime Minister is a woman of few words, but she really faced into that rumbling row in the Conservative Party by saying that she does want to move ahead with her plans to expand the grammar school system in England. She went to that meeting in 1922 and said there would be an element of selection, but then said, do you know what? We already have selection in our school system. It's called selection by house price. And she would like to deal with that, focusing her reforms particularly on disadvantaged children. And one idea doing the round is that you could say that grammar schools would have to give 50% of their places to the poorest children. Those are the ones that are on free school meals. So we just thought this is an issue that has bedevilled particularly English politics for the last 40 years. So we thought we would take a look at the dilemmas facing Theresa May. It is a line no political leader has been able to cross in 4 decades: widen academic selection. Now Theresa May wants to go where Margaret Thatcher dared not tread as Education Secretary and as Prime Minister. Ring the bell for grammar schools. This has delighted traditionalists.
It goes right to the core of what I believe in as a Conservative, that we should have the opportunity to progress in life, that where we end up in life shouldn't be dictated by where we start. It does seem to me absurd that if parents and communities want something similar, they should be barred by statute from having it.
But grammar schools are a toxic issue, and there are Tories who agree with Labour, who say they actually failed to achieve their central goal, to increase social mobility.
The evidence is that even if historically grammar schools did enable kids from very poor backgrounds to get on, have an opportunity, nowadays grammar schools are very much occupied by kids from affluent backgrounds, and very few low-income working class kids that we all care about have the opportunity of getting to grammar schools. And that's, I'm afraid, the situation in Kent. It's a situation across the country. And Michael Wilshaw, the outgoing Chief Inspector of Schools, made that point very powerfully only the other day. That's the evidence he sees as well.
Theresa May believes the reforms lie at the heart of her vision of creating a country that works for everyone and not just a privileged few. But the Prime Minister knows that she needs to move with care, because there are doubts in her party, right up to the Education Secretary Justine Greening, who is adopting, in the words of one minister, a sinuous approach on this. I have been told the reforms will be introduced incrementally with no wholesale change, in line with the thinking of the brains behind the idea, her Joint Chief of Staff, Nick Timothy.
This isn't an argument for a full-on return to a selective system of grammars and secondary moderns. If you've got an incredibly diverse market of school providers in a particular county or city, then I think it's arbitrary to say there shouldn't be a new selective school, if that's what parental demand suggests should happen.
Amid signs of unease amongst some of the Tory modernisers sacked by the Prime Minister, Theresa May made clear to the 1922 committee this evening that she would move with caution. Graham Brady, who resigned from the Tory front bench in 2007 when David Cameron backed a speech by David Willits rejecting a return to grammar schools, agrees.
I think the only concern that would arise is if there was any suggestion of a big top-down reorganisation being imposed on areas, whether they wanted it or not. I don't think anybody is talking about that. What we are looking at here, I hope, is a modest measure to provide more freedom, to provide more choice for parents and for communities, and to free people up to have these kind of schools if they want them.
But Labour are confident they can block it.
I think that this was not in the Conservative manifesto, therefore, first of all, the House of Lords will not feel that they are bound by the Parliament Act because it wasn't in the manifesto. There are many Conservative MPs who have doubts or are seriously opposed to this policy, as well as, of course, there are many that support it. So I think that, first of all, Theresa May will struggle to get this through the House of Commons, and then she would struggle to get it through the House of Lords.
Theresa May believes she's found the elixir to reach out to aspirational Middle England voters. Others think she's opened a can of worms.
Alongside Watt, Faraday and Stevenson, the launch of an identical expensive new rectangle that is missing a phone jack probably won't warrant its own set of commemorative stamps in years to come, which heralds the question of the night: if the brand new iPhone 7 is the best our leading inventors can do to excite us, have we reached the high watermark of innovation? Will it be downhill from here, or does the absentee phone jack signify greatness to come? Here's David Grossman.
Ladies and gentlemen, our presentation will begin shortly. So, how does the CEO of the world's most valuable company begin his big product launch of the year? Singing in a car with a comedian, of course. You get the sense there's a bit more sizzle than sausage with Apple at the moment.
It's the best iPhone that we have ever created.
Yes, there were some neat new features, but nothing to rival the startling innovation of the Jobs era. At some point, the new computers will end up with collectors like Mac Smith, a repair shop in East London. But some economists believe that we're now at the end of this period of extraordinary technological innovation, that all the big changes that have transformed our societies and economies are now in the past. That the challenge for the future is how do we satisfy the wants and needs of more and more people with minimal economic growth? The economist Robert Gordon created this graph showing economic growth in the leading industrial nation. That was first Britain, but later the United States. The norm, just 0.2%. There's been a blip, he says, over the last 100 years from innovations like the steam locomotive, the telegraph and the PC. But the trend, he says, is very much now downwards.
The problem we face is that all these great inventions, we have to match them in the future. And my prediction that we're not going to match them brings us down from the original 2% growth down to 0.2, the fanciful curve that I drew you at the beginning.
The theory is that most of the huge advantages of urbanisation, electricity, sanitation and computing have already been reaped. What's left? Marginal, incremental evolution, not revolution. According to other academics, though, this pessimism couldn't be more unwarranted.
I think that the really important age of innovation is still ahead of us. We have innovated a lot in terms of gaining control of the world outside, but we haven't really begun in terms of changing the world inside us. Just as in the Bible, God has the ability to create animals and plants and humans according to his wishes, so we are now gaining, with the help of biotechnology and artificial intelligence, the ability to start engineering and manufacturing living beings. I think that in the next century, in the 21st century, the main products of the human economy will be not textiles and food and iPhones, they will be bodies and brains and minds.
Some economists, though, believe that what's missing today are engaged state institutions to set the direction for innovation.
The famous Apollo Man on the Moon program by NASA actually ended up over time, and that's another thing, actually allowing that time to take place, so long-run policies, it ended up producing most of the technologies which today are in our iPhones. So what makes the iPhone smart and not stupid are technologies like the internet, GPS, the Siri voice-activated system, as well as the touchscreen display. And all those were actually publicly financed.
And without some idea of the big goals for innovation, perhaps then we end up pursuing the short term, the marginal and the trivial.
And producing a pristine, mirror-like surface.
I draw an analogy with Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. You know, as society progresses, we go from focusing on things like survival to things like, establishing the social order to self-actualization and in things that we become more obsessed with ourselves. And I think that's what innovators are responding to.
It may be then that the future will contain innovation, but not innovation that leads to economic growth or makes the growing global population more prosperous. And that truly is a challenge for the innovators.
And that was David Grossman. Well, Theresa May was pressed on another topic today, Brexit, as she returned to the Commons. She managed to hold off the questions from MPs and insisted she had no plans to reveal her hand prematurely. But She's likely to come under more pressure tomorrow from another quarter. Nick's still here and has a little more on this. Nick, what's happening tomorrow?
Well, I think what we can say is that tomorrow we'll see the preparations for Britain's Brexit negotiations perhaps move from sort of neutral into first gear. Theresa May will be hosting Donald Tusk. He's the president of the European Council for breakfast in Downing Street. It's going to be actually their first meeting since she became Prime Minister. Now, there's been some irritation in Brussels that Britain hasn't triggered Article 50. That's the mechanism to take us out of the European Union. And I think when Donald Tusk leaves tomorrow, I think he'll have it pretty clear in his mind that Britain will be triggering it, and they will be triggering it in the new year. And interestingly, from sort of behind the scenes, we're beginning to get an idea of the shape of how the UK sees those negotiations. One thing we're hearing is that senior ministers believe that Theresa May will just concentrate on what are being described as sort of a few iconic issues, maybe only half a dozen issues. And what that is all about is ensuring that she manages to get the best deal for British goods and services. And they're saying 20 million other issues, pensions for former British officials in the European Commission, will leave that to the officials. The other interesting thing is the negotiations will be underway in the new year, but they expect a hiatus for the French and the German elections.
Of course. Nick, thanks very much for that. News now of fresh problems for the independent inquiry into child abuse. Newsnight has learned that the leaders of one of the main groups representing survivors of alleged abuse, a group who've been designated official participant status by the inquiry, have lost faith in it and will recommend to their members that the group abandon it. We'll be speaking to the group's leader in a moment, but first, Jake Morris is with us now. Jake, just how did this come about?
Emily, it was just over a month ago that we got the unexpected news that Justice Lau Goddard was to quit with immediate effect as chair of this inquiry. She was the third chair that the inquiry had had in fractionally over 2 years since it was set up. In terms of why she quit, well, we got a brief publication of correspondence between her and the new Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. Frankly, it told us very little, and this prompted the then chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Keith Vaz, to basically call Justice Goddard and Amber Rudd before him and explain what was going on.
And we got that committee hearing today.
We did get that committee hearing today, albeit minus Keith Vaz for reasons that have been well documented, and also minus Justice Goddard. She chose instead to submit written evidence to the committee, and it was in that evidence that there was something that's causing problems. She complained that she was unable to select her own staff for the inquiry, her own secretariat, and she essentially, in layman's terms, accused the Home Office of fixing the way that staff were selected so that essentially the Secretariat ended up being stuffed full of Home Office civil servants. She said that they were bureaucratic in their approach, but it's not that bureaucratic accusation that's a problem for the survivors. We're about to hear from one of the main survivors groups, a group who represent over 600 children who were in Lambeth's care homes in the latter half of the 20th century, many of whom say they were abused. And the problem here is that it is the Home Office who are one of the institutions who stand accused of failing children in the past. Lambeth is one of 13 strands in this inquiry. There are, it's one of the key ones that's been already started work on. It's one of the ones that will be report back first when this inquiry does finally report. It was raised in the Select Committee today by Chuka Umuna, who's the Labour MP who represents the constituency in Lambeth, this issue of Home Office staff essentially having a big role in the inquiry when the Home Office is one of the institutions who stand accused. Amber Rudd said that Justice Goddard was actually mistaken and that she had been free to pick her own staff.
So why does this matter then?
Well, there's an argument to be made that it doesn't matter, that if survivors groups want to lose faith, however big they are, then and don't want to be part of the inquiry, then that's their business and the inquiry carries on. But the reality is that, first of all, they may well have very important information to impart, and secondly, that it's important for the inquiry to be seen to be credible, to have the support, to have the belief of those who were abused. And it's also worth saying that this is an inquiry that is now under flak from all sides. You've got many who are saying that its scope is just far too big and it should be scaled back. That's something that Amber Rudd, interestingly, today said she did not think should happen. And so you've got that criticism, and you've also got, as we're about to hear, the survivors.
Jake, thanks very much. Well, Raymond Stevenson, representative of the Shirley Oaks Survivors Group, is here with us. What is your sense? What are your concerns tonight, Raymond?
We had concerns 6 months ago when we met with the inquiry team, and our first question I asked was how many people worked for the Home Office. We always knew during our investigations they were implicated in what took place at Shirley Oaks, or the failure to intervene. So to read the document today from Justice Goddard and to read her reasons for being concerned, matching the reasons we expressed a while ago, is very concerning for us.
Do you really not believe that Home Office staff members today, all these years later, can't be impartial on something like this?
We're not going to take that risk. Some of our members have been through investigations before which had Home Office members and staff who were part of it. So we've been through that. So this is about the third investigation Lambeth has been through. So what we wanted from this was it to be truly independent. We were sold a theory that it would be truly independent. If Justice Goddard is concerned about it, we are definitely concerned. Also, there's another issue. The new chair has spent 30 years in the social service department. That would have been another condition for us, because we are accusing the social services of also being part. So there's been a sea change in 2 weeks, change of head, and you've got Justice Goddard highlighting the concerns we expressed.
What will you recommend to your members then?
We have to recommend at this moment in time that we pull out. We've given the inquiry an opportunity to meet us. We contacted them 2 weeks ago and expressed these concerns, and we're still waiting for a meeting. But I don't know how they're going to jump through the hurdles of having two people who we think are compromised. The Home Office is definitely compromised if they're as involved as it seems they are now.
But if you pull out and other groups follow you, this could be the beginning of the end of the whole thing.
Look, for the Shirley Oaks survivors of Lambeth, we are lucky. We set out to investigate this ourselves. We're going to be producing our own report. The first 100 pages will be presented next week. It's a damning indictment of what took place in Lambeth, and also it's a micro of the macro of what took place around the country. So we're confident in our report, and what we wanted to do by joining the Goddard inquiry was share our report with them to help them. If they're not able to receive it in an independent way, we're definitely going to publish it ourselves.
Raymond Stevenson, thank you very much for sharing that. Thanks for coming in. When disgraced boss Mike Ashley turned up in an inspection of a Sports Direct factory this morning, they frisked him and found a huge wad of cash. Nothing illegal about that, of course, yet somehow we're conditioned to find raw, ready cash a sign of the underhand these days, or at least something a little bit seedy. And now there are esteemed voices ready to make the argument that we, as a society, go cashless, or at least use less cash. A leading US economist suggests that central banks should phase out paper currency. But would it work? Lewis Goddell tries to figure it out.
How many of us would pay for something with 50s? And even if we did, how many shopkeepers would accept them? This is at the heart of Harvard economist Ken Rogoff's thesis that high-denomination banknotes, £50 notes or $50 bills in the US are used for organised crime, tax evasion and even spur illegal immigration. If you see a briefcase of $100 bills, you know where it's from, as any fan of Breaking Bad would tell you.
There's a variety of denominations. How much is enough?
Rogoff believes that abolishing high-value cash notes would allow central banks to stimulate the economy by making negative interest rates work better. At the moment, if negative rates are in place, i.e. banks are charging you to deposit your money, you might as well hold it in cash. By abolishing high-value notes, you remove that option and make people and businesses spend. But from gold coins to the gold standard, money has existed in high-value form since the ancient world. How prepared would people be to give up that right? Ask the Weimar Republic or Harold Wilson, politicians have oft come unstuck messing with our money. In this uncertain financial world, it might take a brave one to ask us to part with it now.
That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued.
Well, there's a brave one right here. Ken Rogoff joins us now from Boston, and Fran Boyd, the Executive Director of Positive Money, is with me now. Thank you very much for joining us. And Ken Rogoff, how do you actually see this working?
Well, just to be clear, I'm in favor of less cash, not cash less. I think going entirely without cash in the foreseeable future would be a mistake. Privacy, What if there's an electric outage? Convenience for small transactions. But if you look around the world at the advanced countries, the Euro, Japan, the United States, they're just swimming in these big bills that most people never see. There was a joke that the 500 euro note was the bin Laden because everyone knew about it, but no one had seen one. 80% of our currency is in cash. It's $3,600 bills for every man, woman, and child, pretty similar in the Eurozone, twice as much almost in Japan. And the central banks do surveys. They say people love our currency, just they hold about a tenth of that.
Right.
And they don't know where it is.
Let me talk to Fran Boyd then. If we are swimming in all this cash we never actually use and most of us never actually see, what's the point?
Well, actually, I mean, in the UK, cash is only 3% of all the money we use, and the remaining is 97% is digital money we use with our debit cards. I think it's a really interesting idea to think about moving towards a less cash society. But I think there's a big part of the debate which isn't being discussed, which is what's that cash replaced with? And the electronic money we use through our debit cards isn't the electronic version of cash. They're actually different because of the institutions that creates them.
And isn't that the point, Ken Rogoff, that suddenly you've got the privatisation of money, that if I have wads of cash, I can keep them under the bed or do whatever I want with it, but as soon as it belongs in a digital structure like a bank or a society, then they can do with that what they want.
Well, first let me say the UK is in a very different position than the United States or Europe. You don't have, we have the $100 bill, Europe has the 500 euro, Switzerland has 1,000 Swiss mark, like $1,000. Singapore has a 10,000 note, $7,000. The UK is in a different position. That said, if you look at actual sales in retail shops, they're not using so much these large notes. But if you look at, when they seize drug, big drug busts and other things, they find them a lot. So we have cash declining in the legal economy, and it's rising in the underground economy. So it's an idea of striking a balance.
And there is this seediness now that is associated with wads of cash. If you open a suitcase and it has cash in it, you don't think, what a wonderful surprise. You think, what on earth has gone on here, right? There is that connotation.
No.
I mean, I'm not denying that there are issues with tax evasion, and definitely thinking about abolishing the bigger notes could go towards that. But I think this really throws up bigger questions in terms of what is money for? How do we design a money system that actually works for people? And I think that if we're going to really worry about tax issues and the seediness of big suitcases full of money, the bigger tax justice issues around corporate tax avoidance.
And to be fair, Ken, you never actually address that question.
I don't think they're bigger quantitatively.
What about this question of privatisation? That money is a very public currency, I suppose, one of a better word. As soon as it becomes digital, you lose that.
So I'm not getting rid of smaller notes that most people use. And it's perfectly possible, I discuss it in my book, for the government to provide its own electronic currency at a very subsidized rate. In fact, I propose, and I think in the UK this has been long considered, giving low-income people free debit cards. They do that in the Nordic countries.
What do you make of that, this idea of personalised digital cash?
I think that we definitely need to think about central banks issuing a digital form of cash, and actually central banks, there's more and more research coming out to say that they want to move in this direction. I think, at the same time, we need to look at the actual system and how it works and the structure that underpins it. And I think that it's not necessarily that simple in order to move to a economy that gets rid of cash and just replaces it with a digital currency completely. But I think I'd agree that we need to move in that direction, and we need to think about money being a public good and how we make it work for society.
Do you think there's ever a danger when you start to play around with money in this way that you destroy the value of it?
I don't think so, but I look at it very carefully in the book. There are all sorts of subtle issues about if you get rid of too many of the notes, can the central bank still control the currency? Because if currency was all electronic, it doesn't really look different than treasury bills, and it starts to have to be confusing what to look at with monetary policy. I want to say this is something that needs to be done slowly. You don't know what's going to happen. I'm looking at 10 to 20 years once you get going. I think it's important to provide financial inclusion, see what problems come along the way.
Last word.
Just to say, negative interest rates, bad idea as well. There are better ways that we can stimulate and boost demand.
OK, we're going to end it there,
I couldn't disagree more.
We should carry it on, but we can't. Thank you both very much indeed.
The UK and Australia are to open preliminary negotiations about a future post-Brexit trade agreement. Officials from the two countries are to meet twice a year to discuss the outline of a deal. But Australia's warned that formal negotiations cannot start until the UK leaves the EU, and that it would be at least 2.5 years before any agreement could be finalised. Well, let's go to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith at Westminster. Norman, is this the shape of things to come?
Well, it gives us an indication of the amount of time it might take to actually secure trade deals once we leave the EU, with the Australian Trade Minister saying best case scenario, it'll take about 2.5 years. Now, why that matters is because Australia are probably right at the front of the queue when it comes to future trade deals. They want a deal. Both Theresa May and the Australian Prime Minister of the G20 this week were stressing the common ties between the two countries and how they would both benefit from an agreement. But if it's going to take 2.5 years for Australia, then of course there will be speculation that more complex, much bigger markets, less open, less friendly markets are going to take an awful lot longer, and it'll be an awful lot harder to reach those crucial trade deals.
Thanks, Norman.
One of the country's best-known drum and bass musicians, the DJ Goldie, has threatened to melt down his MBE in protest of the closure of the nightclub Fabric. Last night, the London club was permanently shut down by Islington Council after 2 drug deaths. It's part of a wave of club closures and a warning there is strobe lighting from the very beginning and throughout this report. Kami and Zeram reports now.
The nightclub Fabric in its pomp. There's a sad side to this story, but first let us deal with the now. The pride of London clubland ordered to close, and one of their own, artist, b-boy, DJ, Goldie, apoplectic. It is, he says, a bureaucratic assault on the creativity of UK PLC.
I'm wondering whether or not the likes of me, the likes of Jazzy B, Norman J, Pete Tong for that matter, should just trade our MBEs in, melt them down to put behind a pencil pusher's coffee so it can taste a little bit sweeter for him today and he feels successful in killing counterculture and culture itself, because this country was built on culture.
Does Goldie have a point? Nearly 50% of the capital's nightclubs have closed over the last decade. Historically, the platforms for breaking new underground music. And across the country, clubs, now luxury flats. This is the once world-famous Hacienda in Manchester. It's not just Fabric, which is today sitting empty, bar the boss.
Those platforms in London particularly are decreasing at a rate that is not being seen in places like Berlin and Amsterdam, and that creative drain away from London is exactly the problem of something like a closure of Fabric is going to create.
Now for the serious bit. Clubland in mourning, or the families of 2 teenagers who died here this summer after taking super-strength ecstasy. A police report found Ryan Brown had bought 1 pill inside the club, smuggled in 3 more. Last night, Islington Council revoked Fabric's licence.
The subcommittee decided that revocation of the licence is both appropriate and proportionate.
The police said the club had been warned before and hadn't done enough to prevent drug use. But Fabric has some of the strictest security of any big nightclub. And Britain has been here before. The rave era of the late 80s and early 90s. Cue moral panic, the Criminal Justice Act, and a failure then, as now, to stop young people from experimenting with drugs.
God bless those kids that passed away. God bless them and their families. It's very serious what happened. But there have been people that have died from drugs in and out of clubs, hotels, everywhere around the world, regardless of that. Are you telling me that 2 people OD at their own doing and Fabric's responsible for their actions? Or the music? Furthermore, the music's responsible. Let's blame it on the music.
The music is over. The Mayor of London said he's disappointed the police, Islington Council and Fabric were unable to agree how to keep the public safe. And thousands of Londoners will now lose out.
Kami and Zara.